It was the 1980s. The streets of North America echoed with a familiar sound, the sharp, almost metallic roar of a Detroit diesel two-stroke. You didn't have to see it to know it was coming. That square silhouette, those wide windows, the tall step up at the curb. It could only be the MCI Classic. For millions of commuters, students, and city dwellers, this bus was more than just public transit. It was part of daily life. It hauled workers through snowy Canadian mornings, rolled across crowded American boulevards, and became a backdrop for countless everyday stories. Yet here's the twist. The MCI Classic was never designed to be revolutionary. It wasn't futuristic like GM's RTS. It wasn't sleek or low-floored like the Nova LFS that came after. Instead, it was something far more unusual. The last link to GM's golden age of buses, reborn under a new badge, carrying on a legacy almost by accident. So why did this boxy machine, simple, rugged, and loud, capture the hearts of an entire generation? And how did it quietly bridge two eras of transit history? Today, we uncover the hidden story of the MCI Classic. By the late 1970s, the North American transit world stood at a crossroads. For more than 2 decades, General Motors had dominated city streets with its new look, the famous fishbowl bus that became a rolling icon. But times were changing. Rising costs, shrinking profits, and a shifting corporate focus pushed GM to make a stunning decision. It would abandon the transit bus business altogether. That left transit agencies scrambling. Cities across the US and Canada still needed reliable heavy-duty workhorses. Mechanics and drivers knew the GM formula inside out. Agencies had fleets full of spare parts, decades of maintenance experience, and little appetite for a radical new machine. What they wanted wasn't a futuristic experiment. It was a continuation of what already worked. Enter Motor Coach Industries, better known as MCI. Primarily a builder of intercity coaches, MCI saw an opportunity in GM's exit. In 1980, they purchased GM's bus tooling and designs, inheriting the responsibility of keeping transit systems rolling. But rather than simply reissue the new look, MCI reworked the design. The result was something familiar yet different, modernized but recognizable, a square-faced successor that would be called the MCI Classic. When it debuted in 1983, the Classic wasn't advertised as revolutionary. It was practical. It was dependable. And for transit agencies wary of untested ideas, it was exactly the bridge they needed. Without fanfare, the Classic stepped into the spotlight, ready to carry millions through the next chapter of urban transit. If the GM new look had been known for its graceful curves and iconic fishbowl windshield, the MCI Classic represented a conscious shift towards straight lines and squared edges. Gone was the futuristic bubble glass face that had defined an era. In its place stood a tall, flat windshield divided by a sturdy center pillar. To some, it looked less glamorous. To transit operators, it was exactly what they wanted: a body easier to build, repair, and replace. The Classic's profile was unmistakably boxy. Large, rectangular side windows gave passengers a clear view of the city around them, while the heavy roofline emphasized durability over elegance. Even the front fascia, upright, squared, functional, spoke of a bus designed for daily battles with potholes, traffic, and brutal winters rather than for beauty contests. But in that simplicity lay a new kind of appeal. Agencies found the design adaptable to countless paint schemes. In Montreal, the white and blue livery gave the Classic a clean, modern look. In Toronto, bold red stripes wrapped around its flanks. Across American cities, each transit system stamped its own identity on the same squared canvas, turning the Classic into a familiar yet unique sight, depending on where you lived. Inside, the design echoed the outside philosophy. Wide aisles, tough vinyl seats, and large windows created a practical environment for commuters. No frills, no excess chrome, just a straightforward urban bus that got the job done. The MCI Classic wasn't built to dazzle. It was built to endure. And that no-nonsense approach is precisely what made it the visual backbone of transit fleets for nearly 2 decades. Beneath the Classic's squared-off body lived the true heart of the machine, engines that defined the soundscape of North American cities for nearly 2 decades. Most came equipped with the legendary Detroit diesel two-strokes, the 6V71N, and more commonly, the turbocharged 6V92TA. To anyone who rode the bus, those numbers might not mean much. But to mechanics and drivers, they spelled one thing: reliability. These engines weren't quiet. Far from it. They barked, they howled, and they filled the streets with a gritty mechanical roar. The distinctive whine of the turbo, combined with the raw crackle of a two-stroke diesel, made the Classic instantly recognizable long before it came into view. For some, that sound was harsh. For others, it was the daily soundtrack of city life. Power was delivered through Allison automatic transmissions, which made stop-and-go driving bearable in crowded downtown traffic. Drivers appreciated how smoothly the Classic pulled away from the curb, even when loaded with standing passengers. Transit agencies valued the standardized components. Fleets already stocked with parts from years of GM buses could keep the Classics running without major investment. The engineering was never about cutting-edge innovation. Instead, it was about continuity. These were machines designed to run day after day, in freezing winters and sweltering summers, with minimal complaint. And though the world was moving toward quieter, more refined diesels, the Classic proudly carried forward the gritty two-stroke tradition. It wasn't glamorous technology, but it was durable, familiar, and effective. And that mechanical dependability became one of the biggest reasons the Classic earned its place as the workhorse of North American transit. For riders, stepping onto an MCI Classic was both familiar and demanding. The first challenge came before you even found a seat, the tall climb up its high-floor steps. In an age before low-floor designs, it was a small daily workout, especially for seniors or parents with strollers. But once inside, the payoff was space. Wide aisles stretched through the cabin, flanked by rows of tough vinyl or fabric seats that seemed built to survive decades of use. The large rectangular windows offered clear panoramic views of the city. Students stared out at passing neighborhoods on their way to class. Office workers watched downtown skylines rise as the bus rumbled closer to their jobs. In the cold winters of Montreal or Toronto, condensation frosted those windows, while the heater under the seats fought to keep the chill at bay. It was practical, it was rough around the edges, but it was dependable. For drivers, the Classic was a workmate. The Detroit diesel growled to life each morning with a sound that inspired both respect and reassurance. The steering was heavy by modern standards, but solid. Visibility through the flat windshield was excellent, and the Allison transmission made constant starts and stops far less punishing. Mechanics, too, came to love the bus. They knew every bolt, every panel, every quirk, often keeping vehicles in service for 15 or even 20 years. Over time, the Classic became woven into daily routines. It wasn't glamorous, but it carried kids to school, workers to factories, families across town. For countless people, the memory of public transit in the 1980s and 1990s isn't tied to futuristic machines. It's tied to the honest, square, unmistakable MCI Classic. By the time the Classic arrived in 1983, the transit industry was already looking toward the future. Accessibility had become a growing issue, and talk of low-floor buses was beginning to circulate. European builders were experimenting with step-free designs, and even North American agencies were pushing manufacturers to think beyond the old high-floor formula. And yet, the Classic thrived. Why? Because it represented stability in a moment of uncertainty. Transit operators couldn't afford to gamble on prototypes or untested concepts. They needed something proven, something that could roll straight into service without disrupting budgets or retraining mechanics. The Classic, with its roots in GM's long experience, fit the bill perfectly. For more than a decade, it acted as a bridge, Not a bold leap forward, but a dependable link between the new look era and the low-floor revolution that would define the late 1990s. While futuristic designs like the RTS made headlines, the Classic kept ridership moving in everyday reality. It wasn't flashy, but it carried millions through the transition, proving that reliability was sometimes more valuable than innovation. When Novabus introduced the LFS in the mid-1990s, the industry finally shifted gears. The low-floor movement swept North America, making the Classic seem dated almost overnight. Yet without the Classic's steady presence, agencies might not have had the breathing room to adopt new designs at their own pace. In this way, the MCI Classic became more than just a bus. It was the patient caretaker of a transit system in flux, the sturdy bridge between tradition and progress. Beyond mechanics and timetables, the MCI Classic carved its place in memory through sheer presence. For a generation of North Americans, the squared body and unmistakable growl of its Detroit diesel were as much a part of the urban landscape as stoplights and crosswalks. Kids waiting at snowy bus stops in Montreal or Winnipeg remember the warm blast of air when the doors swung open. In Toronto, teenagers piled in after school, their laughter mixing with the steady hum of the engine. In American cities like Detroit or New York, the Classic became the background rhythm of daily life, shuttling workers to factories, shoppers to downtowns, and night owls home after last call. Its boxy outline showed up in movies, local news footage, even postcards of bustling city streets. In Canada especially, the Classic came to symbolize the reliability of transit through long winters and economic ups and downs. Its sound and look were so familiar that even decades later, recordings of its two-stroke engines circulate online as nostalgia triggers for enthusiasts and ordinary people alike. Transit enthusiasts and preservation groups now treat surviving classics as rolling time capsules. Museums keep them alive not only for their engineering, but for the collective stories they carry. Ask almost anyone who grew up in the 1980s or 1990s, and they'll have a memory. The morning commute, the long ride home, the sense of community inside that square shell of steel and glass. The Classic wasn't glamorous, but in its own quiet way, it became part of the culture, a shared companion through the everyday journeys of urban life. When production of the Classic finally wound down in the late 1990s, it marked more than the end of a model line. It was the closing chapter of an era that stretched all the way back to GM's new look of 1959. In fact, many enthusiasts see the Classic as the last true descendant of the GM bus legacy, even if it wore an MCI or Nova badge. Its legacy is not one of cutting-edge innovation or headline-grabbing style. Instead, it lies in longevity, dependability, and sheer endurance. Fleets across Canada kept their Classics in daily service for well over a decade, with some running nearly 20 years before retirement. A few stragglers continued even longer, soldiering on in small-town transit systems and private fleets after major agencies had moved on to low-floor designs. Today, preserved Classics appear at bus museums and enthusiast gatherings, their boxy frames instantly sparking recognition. Younger fans admire them for their rugged character, while older riders smile at the memories of everyday journeys. The Detroit diesel sound, once routine, now feels like a rare artifact of a noisier, grittier time. Perhaps most importantly, the Classic proved that sometimes the ordinary machines are the ones that make the deepest mark. It didn't promise the future. It simply did its job, year after year, and in doing so became woven into the fabric of countless lives. That quiet strength, the ability to serve faithfully without seeking glory, is the true legacy of the MCI Classic. The MCI Classic was never built to impress. It didn't dazzle with futuristic curves or boast about cutting-edge technology, but maybe that's why it mattered so much. It was steady, familiar, and unshakably reliable. a bus that carried millions without asking for attention, a quiet companion through decades of everyday life. For some, the memory is the sound, that raw Detroit diesel echoing between city blocks. For others, it's the sight, a square bus pulling up in the snow, doors folding open to a rush of warm air. And for many, it's simply the feeling of routine, the school commute, the ride to work, the daily journeys that stitched life together. The Classic has long since given way to sleek, low-floor designs. But its legacy lingers, not in glossy brochures or engineering breakthroughs, but in the memories of those who rode it, drove it, or kept it alive in the garage. It was, in its own way, the last of the great GM lineage, and a symbol of endurance in a changing world. What about you? Do you remember riding an MCI Classic, the sound, the ride, or the colors of your city's fleet? Share your stories in the comments. If this brought back memories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey into the machines that shaped our lives.